There was a time when her voice could stop a room cold. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. It was pure, the kind of sound that made you look up from whatever you were doing and just listen. From the soft harmonies of the Friends of Distinction to the wild, electric world of Parliament-Funkadelic, she shaped the sound of an era, and yet, somehow, history forgot her name. How does a voice that defined the heartbeat of funk vanish from the story it helped create? This is the journey of Jessica Cleaves, the woman whose voice once carried the spirit of soul itself. Let's get into her story right now. Let me know where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or water, and let's start this journey together. Before the applause, before the lights, there was just a girl from Los Angeles, a dreamer, with a voice too big for the small rooms she sang in. Jessica Cleaves was born on the 10th of December 1948, in the heart of California, to Mary Cleaves, a librarian, and Lane Cleaves, a U.S. postal worker. It was an ordinary family, living a quiet life, but music was always in the air. On Sunday mornings, gospel records spun in the living room, and little Jessica would hum along until her mother smiled. Los Angeles in the late 1950s was a city of change jazz clubs on Central Avenue, soul radio on every block, the echoes of church choirs mixing with the sound of car horns. That mix of spirit and rhythm became the language of her childhood. She didn't just listen to music, she studied it. Each note, each breath, each moment of silence taught her something about how emotion could be turned into sound. At school, teachers noticed that she carried herself differently. When most kids were chasing playground games, Jessica was chasing melodies. Her voice had the warmth of gospel but the control of jazz, something that felt both sacred and streetwise. People began to talk about her as the girl with the golden tone. In the mid-1960s, she was accepted into the California Institute of the Arts, where she trained in vocal performance and theory. It wasn't just about learning technique, she was learning identity. One of her classmates, Skip Scarborough, would later write some of R&B's most timeless songs, and even then, he told friends that Jessica's voice was something special. She doesn't sing, he once said, she breathes color. Those years in college shaped her into more than a singer. They turned her into an artist, someone who could cross the borders between gospel, jazz, and funk without ever losing herself. Yet, like many young dreamers, Jessica was restless. The idea of performing in front of real crowds, not classrooms, kept her awake at night. By the late 1960s, the city's nightlife was alive with opportunity. The soul explosion was everywhere, the Fifth Dimension, the Supremes, the Temptations. Los Angeles was no longer just a movie town, it was a sound. Jessica found herself performing at small clubs, sometimes for little or no pay, just to feel the heat of the spotlight and the pulse of a live band behind her. Those smoky rooms became her real education. It was around this time that she met Floyd Butler, Harry Elston, and Barbara Love, three local talents who shared the same hunger and harmony. They began rehearsing together, blending voices until something magical happened. The harmonies clicked, the energy rose, and the Friends of Distinction were born. Jessica was just 18, but her confidence made her seem older, like someone who had been singing for lifetimes. Their sound was unlike anything else in Los Angeles, rich, layered, and hopeful. When they performed Grazing in the Grass, the song caught fire on local radio. Listeners didn't know her name yet, but they remembered that voice, clear, radiant, and alive. She could glide between optimism and heartbreak in the same phrase. People close to her remembered that she never chased attention. She wanted respect, not fame. While others talked about contracts and record deals, Jessica talked about feeling about how a song should make you feel something before it makes you move. That mindset would follow her through every stage of her career. Back home, her parents watched her rise with quiet pride. They had raised her to be grounded, to keep faith at the center of everything. Even as the gigs became bigger, Jessica never stopped visiting the small church where she first sang. She once said that every stage she stood on felt like an altar, a place to offer her truth. Looking back, those early years were the heartbeat of who she was, not just a singer, but a storyteller who carried the voices of her family, her city, and her generation. She was part of a wave of young black artists who didn't just want to make music, they wanted to make meaning. Before fame came calling, before the spotlight and the noise, Jessica Cleaves was already finding her rhythm. It was the rhythm of faith, of ambition, and of a young woman who believed her voice could reach beyond the walls of her world. And it did. When Jessica Cleaves joined the Friends of Distinction, she was barely 18, but her presence changed everything. The group was still just a collection of voices rehearsing in living rooms and church halls around Los Angeles, but the moment she opened her mouth, everyone stopped. There was something in her tone, soft but commanding, that made even the air feel different. The late 1960 was a golden time for vocal harmony groups. Yet, what set the Friends of Distinction apart was their mix of sophistication and soul. They were elegant but earthy, the kind of act that could perform at a college dance one night and a downtown supper club the next. When former football legend Jim Brown discovered them performing at a local show, he saw what many had missed: potential that could cross over from black radio to mainstream America. Brown became their manager, introducing them to executives at RCA Records. Soon, the Friends of Distinction were recording their first singles, and Los Angeles began to buzz. Their breakout hit, Grazing in the Grass, turned the city's energy into sound, upbeat, free, almost cinematic. And behind those harmonies was Jessica, her soprano soaring like sunlight over steel. Her contribution went beyond notes. She shaped the feeling of the songs. When she sang, "I Really Hope You Do," or "Going in Circles," her phrasing wrapped sorrow in hope. It was a balance only someone with deep emotional intelligence could achieve. She didn't need to dominate a track, she elevated it. Listeners might not have known her name, but they felt her spirit every time the record spun. The group became crossover favorites. They performed on television shows, toured the country, and shared stages with some of the era's biggest acts. For Jessica, it was a whirlwind: flights, rehearsals, interviews, spotlights. She once said in an interview that she never got used to hearing her own voice on the radio. "It feels like someone else," she laughed, "like I'm singing from another life." But behind the success, there was restlessness. Jessica had always been an artist searching for meaning, not just applause. As the band's schedule grew busier, the music felt less personal. The harmony that once felt like family began to feel like business. She longed for something raw, more spiritual, the kind of sound that first made her fall in love with music. By 1972, she made a quiet but bold decision to leave the Friends of Distinction. No arguments, no public drama, just a woman following her instinct. She wanted to explore new ground, to stretch her voice in ways pop radio didn't allow. That decision would lead her into the orbit of one of the most visionary groups in modern music, Earth, Wind, and Fire. But in that final moment with the Friends of Distinction, something symbolic happened. During their last performance together, she sang with her eyes closed, completely lost in the song. When the applause came, she didn't bow. She simply smiled, as if she already knew her next chapter had begun. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage are quiet ones, leaving not because you failed, but because you're ready for something more. When Jessica Cleaves walked into the rehearsal space for Earth, Wind, and Fire in early 1972, the air felt different. The room smelled like incense and vinyl, cables tangled across the floor, and somewhere in the corner, Maurice was fine-tuning a bass rhythm that would later become their signature sound. It was a new kind of soul, one that reached beyond dance floors into something cosmic, and Jessica was about to become part of it. Maurice had a vision: to blend gospel, funk, and spirituality into something the world had never heard. He needed voices that could lift his ideas into the heavens. When Jessica began to sing, he looked up from the piano and nodded slowly. "That's it," he said. "That's the color I've been missing." Her voice added warmth to the group's experimental edge. On the album Last Days in Time, she provided the gentle yet commanding harmonies that balanced Maurice's lead. The song "I'd Rather Have You" became a showcase of that chemistry, her voice floating behind his, like a quiet prayer holding the rhythm steady. Critics later called the track one of the band's most soulful moments, but few realized that the depth came from Jessica's subtle layering. By the time Head to the Sky was released in 1973, the band was finding its footing. The energy of their live shows was electric. Jessica stood on stage in flowing dresses, her eyes closed as she sang, her hands open as if releasing light into the audience. Fans would remember the way she moved, not like a performer chasing attention, but like someone channeling something greater than herself. Yet, behind the glow, there was tension. The band was evolving rapidly. and with growth came pressure. Earth, Wind, and Fire was on the brink of mainstream success, and the sound was becoming tighter, more polished. For Jessica, the process felt different. She was an artist driven by emotion, not control. In the studio, she sometimes pushed for takes that captured feeling over perfection. Maurice, ever the perfectionist, pushed the other way. The creative friction grew. By the end of 1973, Jessica felt that her place in the group was shifting. She had helped shape the foundation, but the next version of Earth, Wind, and Fire was heading towards stardom, a machine of spectacle and precision. She loved them, but she knew she didn't belong in that machinery. Quietly, she left the band. Officially, she departed before Maurice could make the decision himself. But to those who knew her, it wasn't a retreat, it was an act of grace. She had always followed instinct, not ego. She believed music should lift people up, not grind them down. After she left, Earth, Wind, and Fire exploded into superstardom. Songs like Shining Star and That's the Way of the World became anthems of a generation. Jessica never spoke bitterly about it. When asked years later if she regretted leaving, she smiled and said, "No, that was their moment. I just had to find mine." That moment would come from a direction no one expected: the psychedelic, genre-bending world of George Clinton and Parliament-Funkadelic. Jessica was about to trade polished harmonies for raw groove, white suits for neon lights, and radio hits for revolution. And in doing so, she would leave a mark not even time could erase. Detroit, in the mid-1970s, wasn't just a city, it was a sound. Grit, sweat, and rebellion echoed through every bass line that came out of its studios. When Jessica Cleaves arrived there, she entered not only a new scene, but a new world. This was Parliament-Funkadelic, the wild, theatrical empire of George Clinton, where music had no rules and creativity had no ceiling. The first time George heard Jessica sing, he didn't say much. He just grinned and said, "Yeah, she's got that otherworldly thing." That thing was the blend of gospel grace and jazz phrasing that made her stand out in any mix. Within weeks, she was in the studio with Funkadelic, cutting vocals for Tales of Kid Funkadelic in 1976. Her voice became the connective tissue between the chaos and the beauty, the light that made the madness make sense. Recording with Funkadelic wasn't like anything she had known before. There were no strict schedules, no endless retakes. Sessions started at midnight, stretched into dawn, and half the time, nobody knew if they were rehearsing or recording. The room smelled like incense, sweat, and something wilder. Jessica thrived in that energy. She wasn't just singing notes. She was experimenting, bending her tone until it became part of the rhythm itself. On Uncle Jam Wants You, 1979, her vocals floated through the mix like smoke, sometimes leading, sometimes hiding in the groove, but always essential. The songs weren't just funk, they were movement, attitude, theater. George Clinton once joked that Jessica could sing a smile and make it sound like sin. It was the peak of the funk revolution. Audiences didn't just come to listen, they came to witness. Costumes, lights, stories, and messages all collided in a cultural explosion. On stage, Jessica was radiant, shimmering gowns, gold hoops, and that unmistakable poise. Her voice could cut through the thickest groove and still sound pure. She didn't need to dominate. Her strength was in how she completed the picture, filling spaces no one else could hear. Fans of Parliament-Funkadelic didn't always know who was singing what the band was, a massive collective of talent, but insiders knew her contribution. She gave the sound its heart. On Glory Holla Stupid and the electric spanking of War Babies, her layered harmonies added warmth to the funk's grit, bridging the spiritual and the sensual. For Jessica, it was liberation. She had found a place where music wasn't boxed in by genre or gender. She could scream, whisper, improvise, or vanish behind a wall of horns, and it all mattered. With Funkadelic, she once said, "I learned that the craziest things can be the most honest." Those years were her creative peak, loud, fearless, unpredictable. She was part of a revolution that turned funk into philosophy, performance into protest. What she didn't know was that every revolution, no matter how bright, eventually fades into silence. At the height of the funk era, everything seemed limitless. The stages were bigger, the lights brighter, the music louder. But for Jessica Cleaves, the noise also came with silence. Behind the costumes and chaos, she began to feel invisible. Parliament-Funkadelic was a movement, not just a band. Yet, like many movements, its women were often hidden behind its men. While George Clinton and Bootsy Collins became household names, Jessica's name slipped quietly between the liner notes. Her voice filled stadiums, but her credit often disappeared into a paragraph if it appeared at all. It wasn't just about fame, it was about recognition. She had been part of something that changed the sound of America, yet she watched others take the spotlight. In interviews, people asked about the band's style, its madness, its genius, but never about the woman whose harmonies made those moments soar. Friends who saw her during that time said she carried herself with quiet grace. She never complained, one of them recalled. She just kept showing up, singing her heart out, like she was born to give. Still, the imbalance weighed on her. The music industry in the late 1970s didn't make space for women, especially not for black women who weren't front and center. Many female artists found themselves celebrated for their looks or ignored entirely for their craft. Jessica refused to play that game. She wanted to be known for her art, not her image. Her artistry was deep. She brought spiritual depth to even the wildest funkadelic tracks, grounding the madness in meaning. George Clinton admired that. He often said that she reminded him of the choir in a storm. But even that admiration couldn't change the reality. The spotlight simply wasn't built to hold everyone. By 1980, as the band's success began to fracture under creative and legal pressures, Jessica felt the energy shifting. What once felt like freedom began to feel like fatigue. Endless touring, record label disputes, and the growing chaos around the P-Funk collective drained her. She stayed through the electric spanking of War Babies, but afterward, she quietly stepped away from the circus. She wasn't bitter, just tired. The fame, the noise, the constant movement, it all blurred together. She wanted peace, something honest again. After more than a decade in the center of funk's greatest experiment, she chose something radical: silence. But her absence was louder than anyone expected. Musicians noticed when she was gone. The harmonies felt thinner, the soul less grounded. Fans didn't know her name, but they felt the difference. The warmth that used to balance the madness had vanished. In a way, her story mirrored the story of many women in music, the ones who built the foundation but never stood on it. She had given her best years to sound, to art, to others' success. Yet, in the end, when people listed the architects of funk, her name was rarely spoken. It's a strange thing how a voice that helped define a generation could fade so quietly. But that's the truth of Hollywood, and of music, too. The spotlight shines brightest on a few, while the rest carry its weight in the dark. Jessica Cleaves never stopped singing. She just stopped being heard. When the lights went down and the tours ended, Jessica Cleaves faced something she hadn't known in years: quiet. No band rehearsals, no studio calls, no long nights filled with laughter and smoke, just silence. And for an artist who had lived her entire life through sound, that silence was deafening. After leaving the orbit of Parliament-Funkadelic, she stayed in Detroit for a while. The city that had once pulsed with music now seemed slower, colder. She did a few small projects, a guest appearance here and there, but the spotlight that once followed her had already moved on. The 1980 music world was changing, funk was giving way to disco, and soon to synth-driven pop. The sound she helped shape was being rewritten without her. Jessica never chased trends. She wasn't built for that. She had always seen music as expression, not competition. But as the industry transformed, artists like her soulful, raw, unmanufactured began to disappear from the charts. She wasn't bitter, but she could feel time closing in. Still, she couldn't completely walk away. She lent her voice to George Clinton's solo projects, like Computer Games in 1983 and R&B Skeletons in the Closet in 1986. Her presence in those records was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder of the warmth that had once defined the golden age of funk. Listeners might not have recognized her name in the credits, but they heard her spirit woven through the music. Then, almost as suddenly as she arrived, she was gone. There were no farewell concerts, no public statements. She simply vanished from the scene, not out of defeat, but perhaps out of self-preservation. Friends say she valued peace more than fame. She had given the world her youth, her voice, her soul. Maybe what she needed most was rest. Some said she returned to Los Angeles, Others claimed she lived quietly in different parts of the country, helping younger musicians find their voices. The truth was never fully known. For nearly a decade, there were only traces: a rare photo, a whispered story, a credit on an old album sleeve. But the mystery only deepened her legend. Those who knew her remembered the warmth she carried, humble, grounded, kind. Jessica didn't talk about being forgotten, one musician said. She just smiled and said, "If the music's still playing, then I'm still there." End of track. By the time the 1990 came, she resurfaced briefly with the P-Funk All-Stars on Dope Dogs in 1995, as if to remind the world she was still here, still capable of lifting a track beyond rhythm and into emotion. And then once again, silence. The woman whose voice had once defined entire rooms now lived quietly, away from the noise. It was as if she had made peace with being unseen. Because in her heart, she understood something most never do. Fame fades, but truth doesn't. As the years passed, Jessica Cleaves faded further from public view. The music world she had helped to shape kept moving forward faster, louder, more commercial. But somewhere, in a quiet apartment far from the stage lights, she lived her life with the same grace that had always defined her. People who knew her during those later years describe her as soft-spoken, still glowing with that calm warmth that had once filled entire arenas. She didn't talk about the past much. When friends mentioned Parliament-Funkadelic or Earth, Wind, and Fire, she smiled politely, as if they were speaking about someone else. It wasn't denial, it was peace. She had made her mark and didn't need to chase its echo. Music never completely left her life. Some say she still sang at small gatherings, lending her voice to church choirs or neighborhood events. There were no cameras, no reporters, just her, a microphone, and a few people who still remembered what that voice could do. For her, that was enough. But time, like fame, is merciless. In early 2014, Jessica suffered a severe stroke. News of her condition spread quietly through old music circles, the kind of whisper that travels through musicians who still keep each other's numbers after decades. Messages of concern came from former collaborators, backup singers, and fans who had never forgotten her. On the 2nd of May 2014, Jessica Cleaves passed away at the age of 65. The news didn't make major headlines. There were no televised tributes or industry statements. But in corners of the internet, on funk forums, vinyl collector pages, and soul radio programs, fans began posting her songs. "I'd Rather Have You," "Going in Circles," "Electric Spanking of War Babies." They listened not to mourn, but to remember. Her passing carried a quiet sadness. She had given her life to music, yet the world barely noticed her departure. But for those who understood, the loss was profound. When Jessica died, one old friend said, a whole era lost its heart. What makes her story so moving isn't the tragedy, it's the truth. She never lived for recognition. She lived for expression. Every note she ever sang came from a place of honesty. In the end, that honesty outlived the fame. Today, her voice still lingers in the grooves of those old records, in the warmth of a vinyl crackle, in the harmonies that shaped generations of soul and funk. She may have disappeared from the spotlight, but she never disappeared from the sound. Because the sound, that pure, soulful sound, was Jessica Cleaves. For most people, the name Jessica Cleaves doesn't ring a bell. But if you've ever listened to soul or funk from the golden years of American music, you've already heard her. You've heard her in the way a harmony blooms inside a chord, in the warmth that softens a groove, in the echo of a voice that seems to come from somewhere between joy and sorrow. Jessica's legacy isn't built on fame, it's built on sound. She was one of those rare artists who could transform the atmosphere of a song without standing in the spotlight. Her voice carried the elegance of jazz, the strength of gospel, and the freedom of funk, three worlds that rarely coexist in one artist. That's why her tone was unforgettable. It wasn't just beautiful, it was complete. When music historians revisit albums from Earth, Wind, and Fire or Parliament-Funkadelic, they often find her voice tucked between the lines, an invisible thread holding everything together. Maurice once called the early Earth, Wind, and Fire sessions a search for harmony between heaven and earth. Jessica was that harmony. And George Clinton, the mastermind of funk's most outrageous experiments, once described her as the calm in the storm. She taught a generation of musicians quietly that power doesn't always have to be loud. Through her phrasing, she proved that emotion could be restrained and still deeply felt. The singers who followed Chaka Khan, Denise Williams, Erykah Badu, all carried pieces of that same philosophy. Soul is not about volume, it's about truth. Beyond her recordings, her spirit became part of a cultural memory. In an era dominated by male bands and spectacle, Jessica represented a subtler kind of artistry, the feminine strength that kept the music balanced. While many women were reduced to backing vocals or stage decoration, she carved a different identity, a woman whose value came from her craft, not her image. Today, musicians and collectors still talk about her in reverent tones. In interviews, George Clinton has mentioned her name among the voices that made the mothership fly. Younger funk artists sample the very records she appeared on, not realizing they're channeling her energy. Her influence lives quietly. The way roots feed a tree, no one stops to notice. Jessica's work also holds historical weight. She was part of a generation that redefined what Black American music could be: fearless, hybrid, and spiritual. Every note she sang reflected that cultural rebellion, the belief that art could be both divine and defiant. She may not have received awards or headlines, but her contribution was far more enduring. Her voice helped shape the emotional DNA of modern R&B, and even if her name never appeared in bold letters, it echoes through every artist who ever tried to sing with soul, grace, and truth. Because legacies like hers don't need fame to survive, they only need to be heard. For years after her passing, Jessica Cleaves remained a mystery, a name whispered among musicians, rarely written, and almost never spoken on television. But history has a way of circling back to the ones it overlooks. And slowly, quietly, the world began to rediscover her. It started in small corners of the internet funk forums, vinyl collector groups, YouTube channels dedicated to lost voices of soul. Someone would post a photo of Head to the Sky or Tales of Kid Funkadelic and ask, "Who was that woman singing in the background?" Then another person would reply, "Jessica Cleaves. You've probably heard her more times than you realize." Those threads grew into conversations. People began digging through old credits, finding her name tucked beneath the surface, hidden but never gone. For young listeners raised on digital music, her story felt almost mythic, a woman who shaped the sound of her generation only to vanish from it. In an age obsessed with fame, her humility became part of her legend. Funk historians and soul archivists started including her in retrospectives, recognizing her work as essential to the movement. On radio shows that celebrate Black music history, her songs reappeared, those harmonies that once filled smoky Detroit studios now echoing through digital airwaves. The groove, the tone, the grace, they hadn't aged at all. George Clinton himself mentioned her in a few late interviews, calling her one of the purest voices we ever had. To longtime fans, that acknowledgement meant everything. To new fans, it opened a door, a reason to go back and listen. In the 2020 era of streaming and rediscovery, her work found new life. Young producers began sampling Parliament-Funkadelic and Earth, Wind and Fire tracks that featured her vocals, often without knowing whose voice they were using. That's how legacy works. It sneaks into the present, shaping the future quietly. More importantly, Jessica's story began to resonate beyond music. Writers and documentarians started viewing her as a symbol of the countless women who built the foundations of funk and soul but were written out of its history. Her life became part of a larger conversation about credit, visibility, and the cost of genius in an industry that often forgets its creators. Among fans, there's a tenderness when her name is mentioned. She represents something rare, the purity of an artist who gave everything and asked for nothing. When people hear her voice now, they don't just hear music. They hear resilience, grace, and the echo of a time when sound meant truth. The rediscovery of Jessica Cleaves isn't about rewriting history. It's about finishing it, about giving her story the place it always deserved. Because even if the world took decades to remember her, her music never forgot us. Some stars burn out. Others, like Jessica Cleaves, just drift beyond the light, waiting for us to look up again. There's a moment, near the end of a record, when the music fades but the feeling doesn't. That's where Jessica Cleaves still lives, in the space between the final note and the silence that follows. Her story isn't one of tragedy. It's one of truth, the truth that not every great artist gets a headline, that not every voice meant to change the world is remembered by name. She gave the world her gift, quietly and completely, and trusted the music to carry her legacy forward. It did. Listen closely, and you can still hear her in the lift of a harmony, in the pulse of a bass line, in the warmth of a song that feels both joyful and sad. Jessica Cleaves may have left the stage decades ago, but her sound never stopped traveling. It's there every time a new artist chooses soul over spectacle, honesty over fame. What makes her story timeless isn't how it ended, but how it continues through the people she inspired, through the songs that refuse to fade, through every listener who feels something they can't quite explain. She proved that art doesn't need recognition to matter, it only needs heart. So tonight, maybe play one of her songs. Let that voice clear, tender, and unbreakable remind you why music still means something. Because remembering her isn't just about honoring one woman. It's about honoring every artist who gave their light and never asked to be seen. Do you think the world ever gave Jessica Cleaves the respect she truly deserved? If her story moved you, leave a message for her in the comments. Tell us your favorite song, your favorite memory, or simply say thank you. And if you believe that forgotten voices deserve to be heard again, hit that subscribe button and help us keep their light alive. Because some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see.